Sure. So, Henry Jenkins, I'm a provost professor of communication, journalism, cinematic arts, and education at the University of Southern California. And that title gives you some sense of the range of things that interest me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm overall driven to thinking about pop culture in many of its forms. I don't do sports, I don't do music, but other than that, I really am interested in all forms of popular culture. Lately, I've been focusing mostly on comics, but historically, I've done a lot of work on film, television, the internet, games, popular theater, so forth.
Am I
So
remembering?
my interest in games.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Please go ahead. I was just going to say, am I remembering correctly that you also had an interest in vaudeville at some point?
Yes, that was what I meant by popular theater. So,
Gotcha.
yes, my interests go. And for the new project on comics and stuff, I go back to Wonder Cabinets and, popular forms of painting, scrapbooks, a lot of other things that probably don't fall between the cracks when we think about what pop culture is.
Gotcha.
So my interest in games really grew out of my interest in popular culture. That I had played Pong when the first home machines came out. I'd done a little Atari. And then when the Atari company started bulldozing its titles into the Arizona desert, I kind of lost interest in Atari and didn't pay much attention to video games until the Super Nintendo system. And we bought one for my son for Christmas. And I remember on Christmas morning playing Super Mario Brothers for the first time and just being blown away by how much progress had been made in games up until that point. And I realized that games were a form of popular culture that you couldn't ignore or neglect for very long, that they were going to be more central to not only the lives of young people, but the culture at large. And that took me down a path which, at that time I was at MIT, a path that helped me dealing with a variety of different kinds of aspects of games, from the aesthetics of games, where games art, to the moral and ethical issues around video game violence, to gender in video games, to creativity and serving underserved populations in games. I, one time or another, dealt with all of those things. At its peak, I was helping to oversee two different labs at MIT, one called the Education Game Arcade that was dealing with games-based education, and the other called Gambit that was trying to experiment with new genres and forms of gameplay. And we ran conferences at E3. I ran a column for Computer Game Magazine. But when I left MIT to come to USC, I sort of closed that chapter in my life. My students periodically make me aware of things happening in games, but I turned my attention to pop culture and political communication on the one hand, and increasingly comic studies on the other.
So was it strictly a bandwidth issue, or did you sort of sense a feeling of fatigue or just sort of, disinterest with games?
Well, not a total disinterest, but I had done what felt like I could personally do with games and game studies.
Yeah.
I was never a very good player. I was not the generation that grew up with video games. So I could do broad strokes work on games and sort of help people connect, ask new questions about games, connect it with broader trends in the culture, compare it to other forms of media and expression. But the more I was teaching grad students who grew up with games, the more it was clear that game studies was going to become ever more specific in focusing on particular game genres and particular titles, particular auteurs, particular gaming cultures. And my students were better equipped to do that kind of work than I was. So I started to see myself as having been a John the Baptist who paved the way for game studies, but not someone who would occupy that space long term. And imposter syndrome started to set in, that I just didn't know the games the way my students did anymore. And I'm happy to do what I could to support them, which is why I ended up running labs and raising money and so forth. But less and less, I had less and less to say about games per se, because it just wasn't ultimately my medium.
Well,
So I
that's
could see that it mattered, but I thought it was better served by people, and there's an explosion of them, a whole new generation of them, who really were deeply immersed in it in a way that I wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, this fits in with what you're saying. I think, as you're saying, like you feel like you pulled back, and I'm guessing that you have seen sort of the rise of, video game scholars. And what I find interesting is that it seems to me that senior media scholars on other media grew up in a different media paradigm, and games sort of have elbowed their way into the pop culture much more recently, maybe even most pronounced within the last 10 years or so. But from an academic field, I mean, how do you sense that video game studies, how does it still seem young, or that it has slightly less of a carapace than other media scholar fields?
Well, I think part of what I love is, say, the new games, what people have called the new games journalism, or which is maybe in game studies represented by the book series Well Played, where games are seen not as text that we master, but as experiences we have. And so, what a good piece of games criticism in that model does is convey a particular experience of play, not a universalized experience of playing that game, but your experience playing that game, and what it illustrates about the possibility sets, the affordances that game offers. So the more detailed you can get in a particular experience of play, the more you can understand the game more generally. But it's not as if, say, a literary scholar, for the most part, has sat down and said, this is my experience of reading a book, and really been interested in the experiential dimensions of the book. The tendency is to abstract the book as a text that we can interpret and have some faith that in interpreting this text, we're saying something that will be true intersubjectively, that will be true to anyone who reads the book. And film studies, and then television studies, and comic studies, growing in part out of literary studies or art history, follows that same logic, whereas game studies doesn't necessarily. That games, this was part of the debate about games as narratives versus games as rule sets. And to a large degree, my side, the games as narrative side or games as media side, lost to the group that was arguing that games were rule sets or more recently play experiences. And I come to the belief that they're probably more accurate in terms of what you have to account for if you're trying to really communicate why games matter as a medium.
That's something I wonder about too, because I feel like part of that divide you're talking about, or that binary, is there's like in the literary analysis, you're talking about in some cases the creator's intent, of the narrative, versus in games, it seems to be a bit of a mirror that sort of blocks out the people who created it. It's much more, it's a player-focused field. I mean, do you feel like that's something? I know you said that it's been a couple of years since you've actively paid attention to it, but do you feel like there isn't enough of a voice from the creators when it comes to things like understanding, narrative intent and things like that?
Well, I think there is such a voice. I think you have to read things like game developers magazines, where game designers have been very active in, say, doing postmortems of their own games and describing what they set out to achieve, what they felt they failed to achieve. That stuff is a rich resource for doing kinds of traditional games criticism.
Yeah.
So that early on, particularly, a high number of game designers were themselves theorists of their medium, in the same way that, say, Sergei Eisenstein was a theorist of cinema, or any number of other filmmakers have been practitioners, theorists of cinema, or Scott McCloud and Will Eisner have been theorists of comics. So I found when I was in game studies that if I gave a talk anywhere in the world, that I had game designers showing up to hear me talk and think together about their medium in a way that when I talked about film somewhere, I usually didn't have filmmakers showing up, right? Or when I talk about television, I don't have television producers showing up. But we were all involved in a moment of excitement about what this medium could do, and the potential of breaking down those walls or creating a different set of relations to producers was part of what I found appealing about game studies. The danger, of course, is always as things get enter into academia that they become walled off from other people. which is kind of what happened to cinema studies, where fans and filmmakers both got cut out of the conversation of cinema studies the more they become academic. And in some ways, the price of admission to the university is denying other conversationalists that you might want to engage with otherwise. And it often requires a more academic prose that cuts you off from larger popular conversation. So I won't say that's the route game studies has gone down, because I haven't been engaged with it, but it has always been a danger that that would be where game studies went.
You had told me when I saw you last that you felt that the generation who grew up playing Mario Brothers, I think the way you put it literally was, quote, hasn't infiltrated academia. And as I understand it, sort of academic game studies sort of grew up as a bit of a latchkey kid without much supervision. So maybe you don't have a sense of it, but in terms of finding a path outside of those, the walls that you're talking about, I mean, where do video game studies fit in? Is there not a ton of people there? Is it struggling to connect more broadly, or is it sort of a purist area still?
Well, I think what I was talking about was this tension between the culture of games and the culture of books. So what I do think that games players have found some space in academia is defined around higher education and scholarship. Where we know statistically is that the generation that grew up playing Mario Brothers isn't the generation teaching our kids in school. So when we're looking at high school and elementary school level, the teachers as a class is a group least likely to play video games of almost any professional group, because they grew up defining their identity in relation to book culture and often in opposition to game culture. I think universities, somehow gamers have survived and started to infiltrate the universities. And I certainly know of any number of the gamer generation that I taught or that I followed closely a decade ago are now getting tenure at major universities and publishing books, and journals persist around it. But there has been some degree of institutionalization and stabilization around games as an academic field, but it's an interdisciplinary field.
Right.
In much the same comic studies was. And television studies is still to a large degree. I think film studies may be unique among the studies of popular culture that was able to carve out a space for itself, that they're now departments of film studies or cinema studies or, whatnot. Usually there's an additive process where it's cinema and television studies or cinema and media studies. Sometimes games fit into that. Sometimes they're in learning and library science. Sometimes they're situated in the business school. Sometimes they're situated in visual studies. I mean, we can point to any computer science departments. All of them have some space in relation to games, and there isn't yet a discipline of game studies that has its own home base in universities. There are very few universities that have game studies departments in the way they might have cinema studies departments. There are, however, journals and professional conferences, other kinds of markings of an academic discipline.
Is there still a stigma around being an academic and a fan? I know you've written in the past, many years back, about sort of, quote unquote, coming out as a fan. Has the world changed since then, or is there still sort of skepticism with overlapping in that way, or admitting that you're having that overlap?
Well, I think we have to say where in the world we're talking about. I mean, There is fan or fandom studies as another interdisciplinary field that has achieved many markings of academic success. Book series, its own academic conferences, its own academic journals, much of which is run by people who are themselves fans and see that bridging of fan and academic as a productive way of situating their work. Not everyone who's doing fandom studies would call themselves a fan, and there's a heated debate in fandom studies about that label, ACA-fan, that I use to describe myself. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's it's generative discussion still. But that definitely exists. But that doesn't mean that, say, a student at a university which has no tradition of fandom studies will meet faculty who knows the field exists, be received receptively, greeted receptively, will get the encouragement and access to the resources they need.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that someone applying to a general communication or media program will necessarily be embraced if they define what fandom studies is. And certainly in many countries around the world, there's not a tradition yet of fandom studies. So that I got invited a few years ago to give a talk in Indonesia because several scholars there were finding the senior figures in their field unreceptive to the kinds of work they were doing, and they invited me in as a senior figure in media studies to explain the pedigree of that work and why it was important. And I've done that in a number of other national contexts. So outside the U.S., our Anglo-American world, not so much. Outside certain established spaces that have traditionally had scholars who did fandom work, it's a mixed bag. I certainly see plenty of signs. Even here at USC, it can be an issue when someone's applying for admission that people see work in fandom studies as more narrow than they might see work in some other subfields of communication research.
That was something I was curious about, was maybe not necessarily the origins of these stigmas, but whether these types of stigmas, whether we're talking about the business of taking video games seriously or taking fandom seriously. I mean, does that feel like more of a Eastern thing? Is that more of a Western thing? Is it a Western thing that has been imported from elsewhere? That's a super broad question, but maybe I'll just leave it there and do you have a thought?
Well, I think it has to do with cultural hierarchies and how they're constructed, right?
Yeah.
So Pierre Bourdieu, if he was with us still, would probably have lots to say about it, because when he describes cultural capital, he talks about contemplative distance as having a particular elite value, as being the bourgeois aesthetic, as he describes it, and sets that off from what he calls the popular aesthetic, which is about getting into the middle of the game. And he literally, I think, uses the term getting into the middle of the game at one point in his writing. For him, it's the difference between a golf, tennis, polo, where you watch quietly, and football, whether the American or European version of football, where people shout and yell and charge the field and so forth. The one represents a kind of elite, distant contemplation, and the other an immersive, active, emotional engagement with the work. So that maps into media just as readily as it does sports, or just as readily as it does any other art. So media that we feel passion for is media that's often distrusted within the academic space, which tends to value media that we have to learn things in order to appreciate, that require intellectual engagement rather than emotional engagement. That's not a natural part of our everyday life. So insofar as video games are things we actively participate in, create strong emotional attachments and feelings that are part of the everyday life of everyday people, they have a different level of cultural status than, say, Shakespeare or opera or symphony, right? Poetry, things that seem to be moved from that. And so lots of the forms that I'm invested in are forms of culture that I call in one of my pieces, culture that sticks to our skin, culture that's part of us, culture that we feel intimate with, that we're actively engaged with, as opposed to culture that we hold at a distance. And so, I think a lot of the stigma comes from being academic, that is, entering the world of the mind and carrying with us our passions, our emotional attachments, that's our bodily feelings, that those are things that academics often are invited to deny when they do work, when they focus their work. So serious work in academia is work that's abstracted from the world of our senses, since the world of high theory is seen as morally superior to close analysis, and it's close analysis of a art movie or a literary classic is seen as superior to close analysis of a kind of pop culture text. All of this stuff goes hand in hand with the anxieties we have in the academy about the relations between minds and bodies.
Well, when you have, given talks abroad outside of the Anglo-American world, what types of stigmas seem to exist outside of those worlds that we don't have here associated, either with fandom in general or if there's anything specific to gaming you might remember?
Well, for example, in Japan, the otaku comes with its own particular social pathologies, right? The otaku is seen as socially isolated, as, in some ways it's the same stereotype of the fan, but it's amped up because it's connected to mental illnesses there where people want to stay in their house and never leave, right? Which is a more widespread mental illness in Japan than in the United States. Even the first generation of writers and otaku studies perpetuated many of those stereotypes and the negative feelings. There's a level of shame in the writing of otaku studies that's very, very different from the writing of fandom studies in the U.S. or in the UK. Because fandom studies was from the first asserting a claim of that what we're doing is valuable, whereas to some degree, otaku studies is sought to explain from within the pathology how people got the sick. And I think that's a very different feeling. In Indonesia, the problem is that this is a country that doesn't generate a lot of its own popular culture. The pop culture is something that's transported from outside, that's translated from somewhere else. There certainly are traditions of Indonesian horror film, for example, but they have their own negative stigma attached to it. But to be a scholar who's obsessed with pop culture as opposed to, say, traditional folk culture in Indonesia is to be someone who is too westernized, right? Too invested in the globalization trends that are going to destroy local culture. And Indonesia, like many countries, smaller countries around the world, less economically developed countries around the world, is invested in protecting its borders against forms of cultural expression that may corrupt its traditions. So those are two very different debates elsewhere around the world. In Europe, an investment in high culture is even more pronounced in the U.S., but also we see the anxiety about Americanization. In Latin America, it may be anxieties about capitalism versus Marxism, right? And so it's the commercial dimensions of the popular that really get emphasized in the kind of bread and circus argument about, this is Western capitalism imposing itself on socialist economies.
Something I've been wondering about, and you may not know if you haven't been paying close attention to games in the last few years, but you may have a sense of it from when you did. Are there ways that you sense, either as a culture or as a medium or as an industry, are there ways that video games are still grappling with or trying to resist stigmas that they've had on them from, say, 80s and 90s, the 80s and the 90s?
Yeah, in a variety of ways. I think you mentioned Gamergate, and I think there's a way to read Gamergate in relation to those 80s and 90s debates. So that, so many of the groups that were opposed to video game violence that I ended up debating with were mother-based groups. They were, Mothers Against Video Game Violence, the Lion and the Lamb Foundation. These were the critics of games spoke as mothers. So not surprisingly, the generation that grew up fighting mothers for the right to play have a chip on their shoulder about the potential feminization of video games.
Right.
So the misogyny that Gamergate represents is an entrenched response to those mothers who spoke out against video games in the 80s now translated to another generation of women who are simply fighting for their own right to play or fighting for their right to creatively participate in the games industry. So the feminist criticisms, say gender tropes in games, Anita Sarkeesian's work, may well get read through a lens that was shaped by feminist maternal critics of video games, even though her goals are totally different from that. And that may be why this fear of taking away our games comes out so loudly from some of the Gamergate crowd. Now, the game industry is caught between its desire to appeal to its traditional base, existing consumers, and its various efforts to reach out to new consumer groups. And that's been a tension for games regardless of Gamergate, but I think Gamergate brought this particularly to the fore because what were being attacked as not games were forms of expression that attracted women, that were involved with minorities, that reflected the push for games-based education. All kinds of things got bundled into that not real games bucket by Gamergate critics. And so they were pushing back against the games industry's attempt to diversify its market and diversify its content. It's an incredibly conservative force on what video games can do or what they could be. And in that sense, it's also a reflection of the debates I was still seeing in the 90s and early 2000s as experimental games were emerging, as the girls' game movement took shape, as educational-based games were being introduced in the market. All of those things were being called not games by at least some sectors of the games industry and some sectors of games players who were very invested in policing the boundaries of what games could be.
Well, another repetition that I know you personally are familiar with or involved with was, we just had a Trump era version of blaming video games for violence. But did that feel any different to you than what you experienced, on the Donahue show or anything else from a few decades ago? Does it seem somehow different today?
The language coming out of Trump didn't seem very different, but then we've already established that Trump's worldview is 40 or 50 years out of date from most of the rest of the country, right across the board. His ideas on gender, his ideas on race, his ideas on sexuality, on global relations. So we should not be shocked that he has ideas about video games that have long been discredited. Right. He just lives in his own world, and that world is largely a thing of the past, although he appeals to the retrograde tendencies within the culture more generally. Right. What was striking at this time is how little traction he got with that argument compared to the traction the Clintons got after Columbine.
Right.
There was a long tactic of the National Rifle Association and various political leaders to displace anxieties about guns to anxieties about games and use it to distract the media. And the media has generally followed that direction, and it didn't really follow that direction this time. That the kids from I've just lost the name of the Parkland kids. Gave them a much better story to follow, a much more vivid embodiment of what young people are actually like today. One that shows their mastery of all forms of media expression, their active use rather than their passive consumption. And I think that became the story and displaced any attempt to blame video games on what had happened.
Well, depending on the day, I'm either fascinated by or preoccupied by, and you'll remember my asking you a bit about this, but just sort of the inability that games have to join sort of bigger national conversations. So I think with the games thing, I think you're absolutely right. I think I saw like an obligatory wave of media stories either disproving or saying we've already come to a consensus and we've disproved what he had said. And I had seen some pieces that went a little further and got into the toxic culture or some of the toxic culture in games. But for example, just immediately preceding that, like what I was wondering about is just why games were not part of the Me Too moment. And I don't know that you necessarily have an answer to that, but I mean, do you have any thoughts sort of about why games seem to be blocked from these bigger, wider spread moments?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways, the Gamergate debate anticipates Me Too, right? This
Yeah.
was women calling out the harassment they received from other players, the harassment they received within the games industry.
Yeah, it
Insofar as
was
there was a
more, it
consolidation
was
of feminist
more, it was
critics
more,
and women in the
yeah.
industry, it was part of Me. It was ahead of Me Too. But Me Too has not generally, you're right, has focused on filmmakers, television personalities, journalists, now authors with Juno Diaz, but not so much game designers.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a status that the games industry would be happy to pass up. Um,
Yes, I
you
would
know,
agree.
that the game designers may be guilty of the same things, but it's going to take the media a while to filter down to that. Uh,
Yeah.
to me, the more interesting symptom is what gets included in something like Entertainment Weekly or Pop Culture Happy Hour. These spaces that try to claim to cover the entirety of pop culture,
Yes.
neither which has any coverage of games whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Every so often, Pop Culture Happy Hour will cover comics, generally in relation to film or television. Every so often, EW will have something on comics, but games, and every so often something on games, but they have never established a regular section on games in the way that they have a regular section on television. Uh, and I think that's interesting given the numbers of money raised by film, television, and games. Games, most accounts, I haven't seen the latest numbers, often makes more money than either of the other two media.
Right. Yes, right. You had mentioned that before, that EW is a good barometer for sort of seeing what the mainstream sees or doesn't see. So, I mean, as coming at it from a journalist perspective, like, is it naive? Like, what is sort of the best way to sort of or maybe it's not even about journalism, just like, who do you think is in the best position then to sort of broaden understanding of and to, decipher these streams of microculture? In my case, games, but obviously you pay attention to other things that are not part of those types of shows. So who best to sort of, yeah.
I mean, I think the blogosphere and the podcast sphere is where we're going to see this stuff first. And we're definitely seeing good coverage of games in both of those sectors. If we
Yeah.
think about the current generation of television critics who have a deeper, more passionate engagement with television as a media, I think about someone like Maureen Ryan, who worked for Huffington Post and Variety, and I don't know where she's working right now. But Mo
Yeah.
came out of the Rotten Tomatoes, not Rotten Tomatoes, the shit. This blog that did recaps and critiques of television shows a decade or so. There's a whole generation of writers that came out of that who are now doing really good television criticism, right? And they came out of fandom and they came out of these experimental digital spaces, and gradually they've made their way into the dominant publications of our period. And television looks different today. Television criticism is a different status today as a result of that. We're seeing those same kinds of spaces grow up around games and comics. We're seeing fans become journalists. And so not only am I seeing different kinds of reporting on fandom, but I'm seeing the Dot and the Mary Sue and some of these other spaces and IO 109 covering fans from a fan perspective more and more. And we're starting to see young adult novels written by fans about the experience of growing up as a fan that tell very different narratives than we would have seen a decade or two back. So I think games are going to have to go through that same process. And maybe games and comics are both working their way through the system at about the same pace right now in terms of developing indigenous critics who then need to be hired by more mainstream publications in order to get the full impact of the shift in thinking.
Are those mainstream publications? I mean, because another overlap with this too is sort of the state of the media being in doubt, maybe more than it's been before. I mean, are these mainstream publications, are they still as powerful beacons, or do they have as powerful spotlights as they did pre-modern internet, as they had in the 90s?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. We are seeing some reverse movements towards these critics who are staying in the blogosphere, the podcast realm, and making their own revenue streams there that allow them to support themselves without going to the mainstream.
Right.
And as newspapers are shedding pages and shedding staff, there may be less opportunities for the kind of mainstreaming process I'm describing to take place. And we're even seeing that with television. Television is where, as I said, the stalking horse for all of this. We're seeing certain writers move away from print back to the digital as their dominant platform again, and going it alone more than they're going it in ties to publications, which maps onto other trends that are affecting the new generation of journalists coming into the world. So I don't know. I still think there's a power to being heard in those mainstream publications. What we used to see is what we may see now is legacy media, what used to be the dominant media of our time. I think they still are the shared media that more people look at, even if we also read more niche media that reflects our particular interest. So the question of what has status in those shared media versus what has status in niche media still matters to people. If we're going to have a conversation with other people, it's still got to be on the basis of stuff that we all share. Now, as a Facebook user, I can share things on my social media and create some of my own publications, but I think that's different from showing up at a cocktail party where everyone sort of knows what's covered in mainstream news, even if they still may have a sense in my social circle of what was in EW this week.
Well, you had mentioned something, and this is related to that, and another factor in this type of equation is you mentioned a contemporary phenomenon, which was sort of the advent of the TV showrunner as a celebrity into itself, which I thought was a really good point, but I'm fuzzy on because it just seemed to happen organically as I grew up. But how did that happen? Was it just certain TV shows hit a certain critical mass that people were naturally curious, or was there some other way that people behind these shows, became known quantities and media darlings?
Well, I think we can trace its origins as far back as the 60s, right? Whether we're talking about, the 70s with Norman Lear would be an example of a showrunner, producer who became a brand. We can think about something like the Making of Star Trek book that made Gene Roddenberry a household name. So those two things, there's a kind of branding that starts to take place around a limited number of showrunners. Bram Tinker, Stephen Bochco, so forth. These become kinds of brands that people recognize. Then the status rises, I think, when someone like David Lynch produces Twin Peaks. And you can't deny that Twin Peaks is tied to authorship, right? That you have a cinema auteur lending their credibility to television as a medium, and it's hard to discuss Twin Peaks without talking about David Lynch.
Right.
And from that point forward, then you start to see HBO and then the streaming platforms, Showtime, all of these things distinguish themselves by having quality television, which frequently meant authored television, which meant that they then had to put forward the author's biography and give a pedigree to the shows they produced. And in some cases, they were filmmakers who crossed over to television. Steven Soderbergh comes to mind. They might also be television people who emerged and just became famous on their own own terms. So Chandra Rhimes, for example, would
Mm-hmm.
be someone who emerges from television itself and develops a reputation. But that process then has to be taken up by critics and fans as a way of describing their relationship to television content. And I think that generation of television critics I'm talking about, who really paid attention to who made television, as well as understanding the particulars of television as a medium, they paved the way for a particular way of thinking about television that we use now more and more in the era of peak television, or the era of too much good television, as people have called it, the sense of sorting out the pieces when there's so much television being produced. So we started to see some of that with game designers, by the early 2000s, a Will Wright or Peter Molyneux or Sid Meier's, others started to develop that kind of authorial status. You started to see things like American McGee's Alice, where the game designer's name was before the title, in the way Frank Capra's or Hitchcock's films or Walt Disney's films had that sort of status. I'm not paying enough attention, but I don't hear nearly as much discussion of game designers as authors now than we were hearing for a while. But I don't know if that's true or not.
You're saying you have a sense that it's declined somewhat?
My perception is it's declined, but I'm not immersed enough to really know.
Well, I would agree. I mean, it's accurate, and the thing with the designers you had mentioned is they're all of that same generation, and there has been some concern I have heard in my interviews of where are these names going to come from in the next generation, which I think in general in media there's more fascination with how much money individuals are making, either playing games or creating them, but less on who they are and what they have to say.
Yeah, and I think that even in the journalism world, the notion of an author seems central to the notion of cultural status and respectability, right? Those genres, so film became an art when the auteur theory gave us a language to talk about film authorship. Television is becoming an art when we recognize the showrunner. Comics become art when certain graphic novel creators like Art Spiegelman become household names. And games may only become an art when we have game designers whose names are recognized and discussed within the journalistic world. So we see, for a while I worked for a couple of years with Electronic Arts running these creative leaders workshops, which were part of EA's efforts to build a generation of game designers as authors who were creative experimenters within the form and were part of the prestige that EA was claiming for itself. But what I saw with EA was the more it bought up other game companies, the less invested it was in creating name designers, because in some ways it was developing almost monopolistic power within the games industry. And so EA became the brand they wanted to promote far more, or the boutique studios they acquired were the names they wanted to promote more than the game authors, per se. But that was counter to gaming, that getting that cultural respectability that a lot of the game insiders I talked to wanted to have.